As time moved on toward the end of the first millennium, church remained the most powerful social institution in the former Roman Empire. It had all the advantages. It was centralized. It had a top-down system from the Pope at the top through the bishops and archbishops all the way down to the parish priests. It had the ability to deliver a consistent message to people who came to the church. And of course, it had the power of excommunication. The hope was it would not have to use that power very often, but it was available, and it gave the church a standing in the community that no other institution had. The best example of the power of the early church is the Crusades, right at the end of the first millennium. Original expansion of Muhammad and his followers, particularly in the 100 years or so after his death, was through most of the Middle East, North Africa, then jumping across the Straits of Gibraltar to Spain. They took over virtually all of Spain, moved across the Pyrenees, and threatened France until 732, when they lost to Charles Martel and the Franks at the Battle of Tours. And Martel and the Franks were able to drive them back over the Pyrenees into Spain, although they never took Portugal right next to Spain. The mountainous countries kept the Portuguese safe. But they would remain in Spain until 1492. So one of the things they controlled was the area of the Holy Land. The Holy Land is an important area for three of the greatest religions in the world. It is the land that the Jews believe God gave them from the time of Abraham until they came out of the exile. It is a holy area for the Christians because it was the area of Jesus Christ. He was born in Nazareth, and he was raised born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth and in the northern part of the kingdom. And ultimately was put to death and buried and was raised from the dead in Jerusalem. And of course, it is also a holy area for the Muslims because it's from the Mount of the Rock in Jerusalem that supposedly Muhammad was taken up into heaven. Understanding this, the early Muslims were very tolerant. They let anybody come. You want to come visit the holy spaces, they're ours, but you're welcome to come visit. And Jews and Christians moved without any kind of restrictions through the Holy Land. But in the late 700s, a group called the Seljuk Turks, we're not exactly sure where they came from. We think they came from the eastern part of the Asia Minor, but like the tribes that had looked at the Roman Empire and decided, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we had some of what they do? The Seljuk Turks looked at the Muslim Empire and said, gosh, we don't want to destroy it. we want part of it. And so the Seljuk Turks supplanted the first generation of Muslims. And for some reason, and I don't know that it was intended to be long-term, but for some reason they closed off access to the holy places. And by doing so, they got the attention of the church in Rome. And consequently, in 1095, Pope Urban II challenged the knights, the seniors, the leaders of the states or of the individual areas in Europe to a crusade. a crusade to take the Holy Land away from the Muslims and put it in the hands of Christians. And so from 1096 until 1271, there was a series of crusades. Some of them don't really qualify as crusades. The Peasants' Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, it didn't do well. They all got together and made it as far as Marseille when they were all arrested and sold into slavery. The Children's Crusade, you can imagine how well that did. But the First and Third Crusades were significant. The First Crusade actually achieved for a short period of time what Urban wanted. They drove the Seljuks out. They created 4 Christian kingdoms in the Middle East. And as long as they were willing to stay there, they could defend those 4 kingdoms. The problem is these were Europeans. They weren't Orientals. They weren't Middle Easterners. They don't want to stay there. They don't mind winning victories for the church, but they want to come home. And as they come home, slowly but surely, the Turks reestablish control over the territory. The Third Crusade never quite achieves, but it brings together Richard the Lion-Hearted of England, Otto Hohenstaufen of Germany, and one of the French kings, or one of the few times that the 3 all come together, although the other 2 bail out and Richard alone makes it all the way to the Holy Land. So he and Saladin meet, and it's a contest between these 2 great warriors, and eventually it's a draw. The Europeans head home. Richard, interestingly, is arrested as he tries to make his way home, and is left in jail until the English would pay a ransom to get him out. Well, his brother, Bad King John, is enjoying being king, and so he doesn't bother to pay to get Richard out of jail. And Richard stays there for a while until the pressure on John eventually allows him to get his brother out. So the Crusades are what one of the history books I looked at called a successful failure. They're a failure in terms of what Urban II wanted to have happen. But there are 2 wonderful things that happen as a result of the Crusades. One is, of course, that a lot of these large landowners that go on crusade never come back. And their land then is available for the taking. The case in point, Hugh Capet. Hugh Capet is a minor landowner. He owns the Ile de la Cité in the middle of the Seine River in the heart of what is now Paris. But he is able to increase his land holdings by taking land of some of those people who don't return from the Crusades. And he takes some other land of people that do go on the crusade. And when they come back, they find that they have been supplanted. So what begins to happen is, and Hugh Capet creates the first French kingdom in the modern sense of the term, as opposed to the Franks. He is recognized as the beginning of modern day France. And France, from that island in the middle of the Seine, begins to expand out. And the other thing that makes Hugh Capet significant to the development of France is he establishes a line that for at least 400 years produces sons. And so for the first time now, you get hereditary coming into a nation state, as until sometime in the late 1300s or early 1400s. The Capetians die out and a new royal family takes over. It will be World War II before France's boundaries as we know them today are actually established. But all of that begins to happen as a result of people going off on the Crusades. The other thing that happens is that those people who do return from the Crusades bring back in their saddlebags things that the Romans had, things that still made their way from the East into Constantinople, but they didn't make their way on into Western Europe. It wasn't safe. And so when the saddlebags are open, and here are Persian carpets, you know, stop and think about living in a big drafty castle. There's no way you can heat it. If you build a fire at one end of the room, it's cold as all get at the other end. Well, suddenly there are carpets that can be spread on the floor that help keep down the dust. There are carpets, tapestries that can be put on the walls and break some of the wind that is moving through. And suddenly they make the castle a lot more a lot more of a good place to live than it was otherwise. They also bring back spices. The only spice in Western Europe was salt. It was used to salt meat for consumption at a later time, but it was also used to maybe allow us to eat meat that ultimately wasn't fit for consumption. But now they bring back other kinds of spices, peppers and other things from the East that again make a bland diet far more palatable. And the other thing they bring back are bolts of silk. Imagine the lady of the castle generally wore either clothes made out of hemp or whatever could be grown, or they wore clothes made out of wool. And suddenly here's silk. Oh my, where's this been all of our lives? And so there's a great deal of pressure. Hey, where can we get more? And so what happens as a result of the Crusades is that we begin to see the development of a middle class. There is now suddenly, now that we know this stuff is there, there's a lot of pressure on, we got to bring some of this in. And so people move from the manors and the castles into urban areas along the coast. Some of them become shippers, some of them become shopkeepers, some of them become insurance underwriters, some of them become bankers to help make all of this happen. And suddenly now there is this beginnings of trade between Venice, Genoa, and Constantinople and the areas of Northern Europe, most famously the Hanseatic League, which is a series of cities along the German, East English, and Scandinavian coasts that create their own navy to protect their ships and establish prices of what you could charge. Now, this stuff's terribly expensive because it all has to get to Constantinople, and all the middlemen along the way add their cost to it. And then you either have to make it all the way to Constantinople, or you have to buy it from the Venetians and the Genoese. And the problem is they jack the prices up. But this stuff is in such demand, incredible demand, that people want as much as can be brought into their area. I say all of that in part because my American history class actually begins right there. It begins with the fall of the Roman Empire and the Crusades and the reopening of what happens. And so some of these people that live in the cities, they don't raise their own food. They don't raise their own animals. They buy them. And they focus on doing business. And suddenly now, instead of just having the lords and the peasants, you got a middle class that in some cases is more wealthy than those at the top of the heap. So the Crusades bring about those two remarkable changes in Europe right at the start and into the second millennia. Now, despite all of this, despite all the good things that happen, Europe at the start of the second millennia has a number of issues that need to be addressed. In the first place, although you begin to see the development of what historians and geographers call nation states, they're slow in coming. There's still no adequate military in any of these areas other than the feudal system, with the lords all being tied into each other. And if my fief gets attacked, then you come and support me. If yours get attacked, I go and support you. And the problem with that is that the end of the first millennia, the start of the second millennia, is the age of the Vikings. Suddenly now the Vikings descend all over the globe. The Vikings are the great seafarers. You know, most people were unwilling to get out of sight of land. They would go from point A to point B as long as they could see land over there where they could go if they had to. The Vikings went everywhere. Ultimately, they established colonies in Iceland, Canada, what they call Vinland, but the remains of the Viking settlement have been found at Belle Isle in Canada. They attacked England over and over and over again, and created a Danish kingdom at part of England. They established control over southern Italy, the area around Naples, and perhaps most effectively, they landed on what was the Normandy coast, named for them, the Normandy coast of France, from which in 1066 William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, will stake his claim to the English throne, and by killing Harold of Wessex, he will launch the last successful invasion of Great Britain up until this time. Vikings were mostly from the Scandinavian areas, and they were fierce fighters. And when the word got out, the Vikings are coming, it sent cold chills up and down people's spine. So as the second millennium starts, the fear of invasion, because they also go down the Rhine River, they attack Germany as well. The existence of the Vikings leave people again somewhat nervous. Second problem that the Europeans had to face at the start of the second millennia was that they were an area where superstition and concerns of the supernatural and the actions of the devil were much in vogue. We tend to think of witchcraft at Salem, Massachusetts, in the last decades of the 17th century, but witchcraft was much more prominent in Europe, and it was especially prominent during this time period. There is this concern about what the devil is doing, how the devil is getting what the devil wants done, whoever the devil is, that the devil is getting what the devil wants done among the people. And the fact that there are humans that may be in league with the devil, and consequently, there are even if something would happen that we would say is part of natural phenomena, that wasn't good enough for people. We're always looking for somebody to blame, something to blame. There are lots and lots of trials for witches and warlocks, and lots of people that are ultimately put to death because of the presumption that they are in league with the devil. And I remember, this is the end of the first millennium. Think back to Y2K. Think back to all the hysteria in America at the time of the end of the second millennium. There were all kinds of, and we're pretty smart people, pretty savvy people. We're not nearly as superstitious and as given to supernatural phenomenon. At least most of us aren't, as people were in that day and age. And yet there were really bright people who thought that every computer in the world was going to die. We weren't going to have electricity because the electric grid was all driven by computers. We weren't going to have adequate water because it was all driven by computers. The banks were going to have to shut their door. Well, if that can attack us, imagine what happens when people get to the year 1000. And of course, within the church, there's a question of, is this going to be the end? Is this when Christ's second coming hasn't happened yet? Is it going to happen now? Are things as we know it going to change completely? All of this leaves an awful lot of people nervous about what comes next. Is it going to be as it has been in the past? Or will this be the end of the story? Now, the third thing that becomes increasingly a problem, and a problem that will continue to grow, is that there is, because of the power of the church and the consistency of the church and the growing power of the lords, the ruling class, those who now claim to be kings, as we have in France, and as we also have with the Hohenstaufens in Germany, and of course a ruling family in England when William shows up. The question was, who's in charge? For a long time, people had looked to the church. The priest was in charge, the bishop was in charge, the pope was in charge, and an awful lot, particularly of popes, were not at all embarrassed about arguing that they were in charge, that if there were issues, people needed to look to them rather than looking at any secular leader. But the problem, of course, is that now that you are beginning to see the start of what will be nation states, you got people that feel like you ought to be looking to us. We ought to be the ones who make the laws. We ought to be the ones who tell you how to act. It's great to go to church because we're going to go to church too. That's fine. But the church ought to be in charge of church things, and the lay rulers ought to be in charge of that. Obviously, we got the potential for problems. Making things worse, of course, is the fact that the lay leaders got armies, or at least they have allies who will come and defend them. The church doesn't. The church needs to rely on the growing power of the seniors, the growing power of the kings, to protect them. And consequently, the church has to make some commitments, some deals. We'll let you nominate the bishops. And if you nominate, if you're a lay leader, you can nominate the bishops for your area. And if we agree to that, then you have an obligation to protect us, because it's something that you do, and yet we also want to limit how much power the church gives up to the state. Well, now, looking at all of this, all the issues that existed at the start of the second millennia, probably the safest place on the face of the earth is the monastery. Monasteries are operating now, particularly in most places, under the Benedictine rule. There is order. Remember, we said they were regular clergy because they did things by order. They could pray. They could get away from what was going on in the real world, if you like. They had available to them probably far better libraries than anybody else did. Remember those same saddlebags that had silk and had spices and had lots of other things in it, also had an awful lot of books from the Greek and Roman period. Now, one of the bad things the early church did was to decide that the Greek and Roman thinkers were not Christian, therefore we don't need to pay any attention to them. And so a lot of the great learning, particularly of people like Aristotle and Eratosthenes and others, was either destroyed by the church or not maintained by the church. But the Muslims kept all this stuff. And so when these books were discovered and came back with the people on horseback, many of them ended up in the monasteries. And so you got people living in the monasteries who are probably the best educated people in all of Europe. Hildegard of Bingen is an example of a highly intelligent person who is able to use the security of the monastery to engage in what I guess you would call a natural history, study of plants and herbs and rocks. And she figures out what we would call today holistic medicine, ways to use these plants and herbs to cure, but also to incorporate in with that spiritual cures for people. She also had the time and the opportunity to compose chants, and she did words and music both. Something that was unusual for that day and age, and created hundreds, many of which I guess I would say have survived into our day and age, and many of which are still used as a part of worship. All of this is perhaps remarkable for a woman, and it can only happen in the peace, serenity, and security of the monastery walls. Hildegard begins as a woman living in a monastery in 1150. She creates the first of her own communities just for women. Many of the chants that she writes are for female voices, a female choir, if you like. And she develops enough of a reputation in her own day and age that despite her sex, despite the fact that people within the church paid only limited attention to what women thought, she undertook 4 fairly extensive speaking tours that were well received. And she moved around through some of the small towns and areas in the part of the world where her I don't know if they're monasteries or nunneries, whatever they're called, existed. And she was brave enough to take on some of the corruption that was she was seeing beginning to grow in the church. And of course, this corruption will continue to grow, and will eventually be part of the driving force behind the Reformation, some 400 years later. Pastor Cyndi will in more detail on Hildegard herself, but the era in which she was prominent. Born in 1098, died in 1179. She's a remarkable person, and it is a remarkable statement of the security that a monastery offered, that she's able to do all of the wonderful things she does. It's a world that is filled with upheaval. And the truth is, in the short term, it's not going to get a whole lot better. Eventually it will, but it's going to take a while. Eventually, of course, the Catholic Church does grant Hildegard of Bingen the status of a saint. And based on her accomplishments in science and medicine and music, and taking a leadership as a woman in a world that didn't want women to lead, she was certainly deserving, and becomes a major focal point of the world, the Christian world, at the start of the second millennia.